Ink Portraits Session 4. We're going to finish our final session with Picasso. Obviously, we have our fine liners, ink pens, fountain pens, or any other type of ink pen, and a brush. Because what I wanted to show you is just go back to our final session. We did Dali, and we work with pointillism, stippling. So just adding a bunch of dots and saturating the areas, creating that fine quality of value and value shift in order to enrich the form, the lighting, and the three-dimensionality of the form. What we're going to do today is take this one step further. So if you look at this one here, we have ink washes. But if you look a little bit closer, it's ink washes plus scumbling, stippling, cross-hatching, and any other type of quality of line that you think you need to add to your washes in order to enhance your drawing. So it'll be a little bit of it's not mixed media, it's a mixed technique of wash and ink. Just like we would do with some of the illustration with watercolor and ink lines. So here we are, and I did want to do a quick demo. And I'm gonna just use this sketchbook here, which I was mentioning, and I will share a link because it is a great quality for watercolor paper. It has 72 pages, and the price, so far, unbeatable. So here we are. I'm gonna open up a sketchbook. You could do this in a sketch paper, or you could just, really what we're gonna do today is take the image, look at the levels image, our notan, and remember I use 3 levels here where we have light, shadow, and the midtones. So we could always add a little extra quality of values to our drawing. And I also included, I believe, a notan. And you can see the difference between the notan and added layers of midtones. So we do take away a lot of information if we're just looking at the light and shadow. Here we have the midtones. You see how volume and three-dimensionality comes into play. So what I wanted to do is take you back one step. And this would be a great exercise if you just take a sheet of paper. It doesn't have to be watercolor paper. Because what we want to do is, I'm going to take a container, a little palette like this. You could use a porcelain plate, hopefully a white one, where you could actually get a good sense of how we're going to be using our ink. Now, if you have a dropper, what I want to do is add some water. And I'm going to just take a brush. And as you can see here, I'm adding water. Just a few drops in each one of these. And I want to make at least 3 of them, where I'm really going to water down my ink. Now, how do I do that? Because this ink, by the way, today I'm using Noodler's ink. It's a little softer, more manageable in terms of thinning the value than your acrylic inks or India inks. So this Noodler's ink, which you could actually use on a water fountain pen, bringing in just a small brush. And what I like to do is this. I will take just, not even a drop, but by dipping my brush into the ink with a very, very small brush, you can see how much this is going to pollute this one here. So number 1 is, actually that was pretty good. I'm using a synthetic brush, and I'm going to test it here. So that's the quality of value that I'm getting for that. Can I go darker? And at the same time, can I go lighter? So yes, of course I can go dark. I'm going just with, let's go this way. This is straight out of the bottle, so that's my absolute black. And I'm going to add some of it to this part right here, so it's easier. And I could begin to add just touches of water. But because this ink really overpowers the water, I want to make sure I could bring in just a little lighter value from 1 to 2 to 3, and then of course our 4 here, where what I do is I bring water and ink from this one and then just bring it over. You could actually begin to see how it changes the value. Now this is going to be way too light. Again, this is the getting used to the Noodler's ink. This, if I just bring this, and you can see the change in color. I hope you can. Now this would take you to, let me just bring it over here. You can't even see it on the paper. But once it dries, it will have a little ghosting effect. You can actually see it right now as it begins to dry. So how to manage and set up your values. And the main thing is going to be not to pollute them once you begin to work from one to the other. So this probably will be my lightest. So if from here to here, obviously it's going to lighten it. I don't want to bring it from darker to lighter. So I'm just going to bring a little extra ink back into this one. I could immediately see the shift and put it right next to it. Not enough. I can bring more ink. Put it next to this one. I'm just going to drop it twice where it's almost obvious. And now we begin to see shifting. So the more values you could begin to play with, I'm suggesting at least 3 plus black and white. So you have the white of the paper, the full black of the ink, and then 1, 2, 3. If you can push it to that level, you're going to be very satisfied. And that's what we're hoping for here. Now, how to manage that? It's going to take, it's not there is no rule for this. It gets a little scientific. And all you have to do is be careful how much water or how much ink you're adding. So I'm beginning to add more and more dips of ink into this water. And believe it or not, if I'm bringing my brush back into my ink, I'm actually adding water in there. So little by little, it is thinning out too. So all of these things to be very careful as you bring ink and water from one well to another. And now we're almost there. I actually just pushed it to about 6 or 7. Like I mentioned, I only want 3. So I think that's a great one here. And now I could bring some from here to this one to darken it just a little more. And then from this one to this one. And I think I'm still a little bit far from where I want to be with number 1. That's a good one. Number 2, we're going to see that needs more. A little more ink. And I could always darken. It's easier to darken than to lighten. So we are going to use some of these, let's call them watercolor techniques in a way, for washes. That's more accurate. Rinse my brush as I bring it over to my darkest. And that's going to be my number 3. So there's my 3. 1, 2, 3. Here's my absolute black. And then there's my white of the paper. So those are the ones I would be working with. Now that I have this set up, I want to do a really quick selection of brush. And I'm going to try to, pretty much just by going, I'm going to use a number 3. No, I'm sorry. This is the number 5 synthetic brush. I want to do a quick, again, I have my ink, my little palette of inks right here. I'm going to go with the darkest one. My number, let's call it number 3. Bring in a little more water. And I just want to very quickly simplify, do a quick sketch of this notan, where I just take one value of ink. In this case, you could go with full black. And notice how in one swift pass here of just one solid value, I could begin to bring out the features of the face and almost finish up a portrait. Now I'm going a little quick here, So we don't waste too much time and we get right to work. Notice that this entire side could be fully black. It's completely in the shadows, and that's how our notan reads it. Or is it? There's a little bit of light right here in the back of the head. And as I bring that shape of ear right here, I could see a little bit of edge of light on it. But it's just a good way to test how we're going to be using a very basic wash. And also how to identify the simplicity of the lines or washes, the shapes of the washes that we're going to be attempting to do in a few minutes. Now we are going to go for a fuller drawing where we are going to, as usual, bring out a better reading of those shapes. Now this brush may be a little too big for some of these. But notice how rich immediately we begin to see. And I'm just working it with space here now. And we get a sense of bringing a little more water now to wash out this face. And then see our Pablo Picasso. And how we're going to manage this just gives us a good idea. And also the main thing is also what brush am I going to want to use. Now just as a quick sketch, can I add a little bit of darker values here where I go in with just pure ink and see some of those washes begin to add a little bit of contrast? Where would that go? So I'm squinting as I see this come together. And very simply, I mean, it's a face. It's not the perfect execution of a portrait of Picasso, but going by this notan and how to really simplify washes, this would be the easiest, most simplified way I could go about it. So I'm going to think through this quick sketch and bring it over to how we set up our drawing and think about those early washes to then set up my lines. So as a key, remember to have at least 3 values. And 3 values could be just the white of the paper, the black of the ink, and just one gray tone. You're gonna see that it's gonna be not enough. It's gonna just push. You could get away with it, but it's not gonna be an ideal. We want to push it at least 2 extra steps. So for that, we are going to set up our drawing. Now we have a beautiful image. Going to my reference. And as usual, we're going to set up our drawing. Now for time purposes here, again, if you set up, I'm using carbon paper. You could use your graphite transfer method, or you could just draw and simplify your shapes. Set up your composition. I am going to tape this to my paper as I give it a quick pass just to map out the basic information I'm going to need. And I'm looking really, I'm looking especially at that striped shirt. So just adding 2 little pieces of tape so this doesn't move. And as always, I'm using this little bevel tool here, the embossing tool, with this nice little fine tip. And I'm gonna consider the composition of my paper. I want to start top right so I don't rub the carbon on the paper. Although when we begin our washes, it could actually work in favor. Some of that gray, some of that color coming into and mixing with the ink. I should mention as well that just like I did the wash on my sketchbook with brush, I mentioned in passing, or in the email maybe, that when we do this, if you have a fountain pen with water-soluble ink, go ahead and do one here really quick. You could... Uh-oh, my ink, is it low? And this is supposed to be water-soluble ink. But using a fountain pen, here we go. Using a water-soluble ink to set up your drawing. And then using a brush to create some of those washes. Now, the level of saturation that you can create with this type of wash, maybe you're going to want to mix it with some ink. That's the other alternative, the other option. So here, obviously, you're going to have something that's way too low. So adding a little bit of that mixture of ink that I set up earlier is going to work just as well. Maybe a little bit better if you like to create your washes from line with a fountain pen instead of a brush. So either or would be the alternatives, the options for strategizing how you're going to lay down your washes. Okay, so here we are. I'm using the actual black and white photograph where I could still see a little bit of mapping of the light, some of the highlights, and I'm using very low pressure to transfer the key points of image, mostly where I see shadows. Shapes of shadows are a key factor for me. They pretty much reveal the whole strategy, how I should go about it. Sometimes we focus too much on line. What you want to do is, what does that line imply as a shape? So we see, for example, the lines on the forehead. There's a shape to them. So if you see the value and the way the light is rolling on, so you see the cylindrical aspect of that line and take it a little bit beyond that into shape or form, you're definitely going to be better off, and your drawing will absolutely benefit from that. So here, very different from the Notan, I have a lot more information, shadows, and a little bit of light within this shadow side of the face. As it's picking up, I'm going to check really quick how my pressure is working. It's working really well. So for example here, instead of focusing on where my line is and trying to shape out an eye as linear, I want to pay attention to the light. Obviously this entire side is in shadow, but there's breaks in the form where the light rolls off. There's lighter, darker shadows, kind of creases in the skin, into the eye socket, right under the eyebrow, and then into the cheekbone. So you see the rounding, darker to lighter, back to dark. And if you could somehow clue yourself, give yourself the hints beyond the line, even though you imply it with a line, you want to visualize it as a shape, as eventually as a form, where the reading of the light is what is key. So how we choose which lines and how much, it describes what we need to. It's part of the training. Your training to begin to see how to choose that. What is that essential information? So this shirt for me is going to be a big part of my drawing. It's going to be a crucial part too. I'm going to love to put down that contrast and variations of value within this shirt. I'm going to map out just a few where I see gray on the white and a little darker black on the black stripes. See how it could be a really interesting element that can, I think, for this photograph, just make it way stronger. And a great chance to experiment with technique of washes and line. Now the lines that you'll be using later on, because with ink portraits, the idea was to explore types of techniques to lay down. We did cross-hatching, hatching and cross-hatching. We did scumbling, we did stippling. But if I don't need any of those, I could just do washes. Well, then that feels like we just did a watercolor. No, the idea is I'm actually drawing with ink. And to get a sense of what you can do with it, you will be creating, believe it or not, some linear aspects of the edges of your washes and how you lay them down. So it's not just, oh, I'm going to set this up and then I'm going to just fill it up with lines. You can strategize. The idea is, what is that ultimate look that you want to give this ink portrait? Am I going to need lines, or can I just do it with washes? In my case, I'm going for a solid foundation of wash and touch-ups of line that are really just going to enhance. And honestly, I don't know how that's going to work. So that's what makes it exciting. Definitely having somewhat of a plan, but not knowing where it's going to go. Trying to really capture a little bit of the expression, some of the final details, and more specific, beautiful little shapes of light here. And as I said, they may be linear at the moment, but I'm really going to try to work in that shape. So the rounding and this side of the face here, where the quality of this photocopy is not the greatest, but you can actually imply, you could see that that's where the bone turns, and you can have a little extra shadow. How we work with the cheekbone and the side of the nose. All of that is going to come together. And I think I have it. So just a little extra mapping. I'm squinting, looking at darkest dark. Just double checking it. Making sure I don't get confused later on. And then have to make up information. And there we are. So my drawing is set. And like I said, image transfer or drawing, all of it part of, in this case, the quality is going to be much, much closer. But how you decide to transfer your image, deal with the drawing, and make it efficient. So next is going to be brush selection and a little bit of brush technique for washes. So I give it just a good glance, quick glance at light. So I'm moving away from the Notan into my And I'm probably going to stick with this one the most. There's few, I mean, and you do see the information. So actually, it is a great clue here for mostly the shirt. Where you see in the shirt, it reveals that light, shadow, and the midtones, where the white and the black appears all as black, but there is light on that black. So from here to here is where I'm going to go. And the reason I use this one more, the reference photo, is because of the shadow side of the face. We lose all the information in this one. But what makes it evident here is that all of the shadow side of the face, it's clear. It's one side shadows, one side light, and how much information I need to add. That's what I'm looking for here. So I tested my inks as I had them here before, set up for the ultralight one. So what I can do here is somewhat apply those watercolor techniques. And I'm just going to start with the background maybe. Just adding wash, water. So I know that this side of light right here is going to require some background. And I learned that from the sketch that I just did a minute ago. Now I could be adding water all over and really creating a nice gestural kind of wash. I do want to control some of it. I want to begin to look at that shirt that I know I could go back over, working from lightest to darkest. I want to make sure, and I'm going to switch once again right here just to get those shadows. So they're here, here, down in here, and just a touch right in here. And I could just bring that in. I'm going to start with the lightest and just drop it in. And the quality of the wash that we're going to apply here, as I said, I'm going with the lightest, plus the water that's on the paper, it's going to lighten it even more. Now it's going to have that wet on wet look. And what I don't want is the background to compete with the light side here, and it's going to be about this light. So I will come back over and add a little darker area to my background as you see it in the image. But the idea of working with ink is the staining power, also the dispersion power of dropping a little bit of ink into water. It just, the way it spreads, it'll be using a lot of that. And I tried it here, but it's so light, you kind of lose that sense. I am going to try it more right in here as I deal with the lighter areas of the face. Now, notice how my washes is, they're kind of buckling the paper and puddling up. I could just bring it in. There's not a lot of white that I need to preserve here. I do want to be careful with this area of the forehead and right here on this side of the nose, where we have that highlight and major contrast. Some touches right here around the lip and the chin. And then begin to build up layer by layer. And now these washes may take a little bit to build up. I could bring in a hair dryer. And I'm not really going for too much of the wet on wet anymore. I'm actually going wet on dry and just beginning to draw. I'm beginning to draw the areas where I see a little shifting of the grays and the lights and how it rolls on the skin, showing me the structure of the bone and muscle. And this first layer, depending on how dark it gets, will set you up for how dark the entire image will be. Because if this is my lightest light, then I need to build it up 3-4 extra layers, then we're gonna have to go 4 levels of darker than what I actually have here. And if this is darker than this, then remember, the darkest we can go is the black ink. So being aware of that, making your first layer ultra light is going to be key. You could always come back and add more, and that's what we're going to be doing. As this begins to dry in different areas, I'm moving into my second well here. Notice that I ran out of the first one. So I'm going to add a little more from the second well right in here and bring in more clean water to lighten it up and kind of refill that little well. There we go. So I go into my second well and I'm just going to test it down in here. So we have this entire area. So just like washes with watercolor, when wet meets wet, it's going to just run. This is actually drying really fast, or a little faster than I was expecting. But I just want to begin to see a little bit of contrast with that lighter and how these washes behave. For example, here, too wet. I'm going to lift just a little, but let it run. Not afraid of having accidents happen. And by accidents, you know what I mean. Those really, watercolor ink type things that happen. Like a big splash of color or... So this is my second value, and I really need some of this in the face as I begin to build up the next layer. So looking at my midtones, I want to start in the darkest area and work it in towards the light, because I know here we're going to be darker. So I'm moving towards the light, letting it blend in. And I did have my lines here mapping it out. And this is going to be the easiest way for me to really begin to see how this is going to be built up. And when I reach the point where I need to stop. So there's a nice area here of mixing of values, because obviously those are the features of the nose, and there's a lot going on there. I'm going to grab a little more water and just lighten it up. So ink does not behave exactly like watercolor. And getting used to how it's mixing, blending, dispersing, granulating. Bringing a little more water. And you could begin to see already. I know there's a lot of light hitting the ink, making it shimmer. But I could begin to see how this is working. So here we're beginning to get that area where I mentioned linear, away from the shapes, and it gets more linear, and we have those shadows. For example, here. I want to lay down just a little bit more ink and let it, hopefully very quickly, with a smaller brush maybe, soften the edge. So I'm cleaning my brush, wiping a lot of the water, but it does have just a little bit of water still. And I'm going to pull that edge so it disperses in this direction. And remember, it's not necessarily a painting feel. You're still somewhat drawing with the pulling of some of these lines of ink. You should have the sensation of dragging and playing with that value. And beginning to look a little bit closer at those shifts in light. And there are a lot of fun ones right here. Under the nose, in the mouth, on the lips. I definitely have to go with the smaller brush now. Moving down to a number. I'm going to go with the number 2. Grabbing my second value of ink. So my second, the middle. Second lightest and second darkest. And I'm going to begin to just drop in. So areas that need to dry a little further, I'm going to leave alone for a second. The temptation is always to just begin to add and darken a little too fast. But the way the ink is behaving on the paper, I'm beginning to dab it in. It's already working. It's already working. I need to go in here just to add a little contrast and build up, because I don't want the eye to just be one solid color of black. If you look closely, there is really beautiful light in and around the iris, the pupil, and then in the white of the eye. So as we darken, be very cautious not to jump too fast. What I'm doing here is I'm layering the same value of color. It's not color, I'm sorry. The same value of my preset ink on top of the previous layer, which was set for that mid-tone. And maybe some of these will be better served as lines. So just setting up the wash to then bring in line could be the way to go. So I'm going to lift some of this right back into the light, and maybe just all of it here. It got a little too dark. And I really need the eyes to dry. Notice as your edges begin to dry, you may not want to forget about them. Going right back into the, okay, this is not my fullest, darkest ink, but this is my level, my value level 3. So it's the darkest one I have on my palette. And while I wait for this to dry, I'm going to go ahead and just bring in some of these lines here while they're still wet. So it's somewhat of a wet on wet technique. And I do like what was happening here already somewhat, so I don't want to mess around with it too much and allow it to kind of show through the layers that I had there already. See, you have some real wetness here still. So I'm going to control and I'm lifting as I drop in just to help it dry a little bit better, faster. But I do want some of that wash, the ink, that beautiful, why we would do this with ink, to show up. I don't want to shut it down and control that beautiful magic it does. Excuse me. And once again, back to drawing with this ink. So if you decided to transfer your drawing and you're working this way, you don't want to lose that sense of drawing with ink. I would recommend trying it both ways. Doing washes without a drawing or drawing directly with a wash as you're drawing. And obviously like we did today where you have a drawing and then kind of build it up. There is something to it where the way you look at it, the way you read it, the way you drop in the ink behaves differently. And you want to give yourself that chance to see which one works better for you. Adding a third layer, my third layer of dark right into that shadow area of the head. So notice how I'm leaving edges. It's still wet, but it's more moist. Almost dry in certain areas here. And almost becoming too dry for some of this. So I'm going to really jump quickly to my smaller brush to help it to kind of drag some of that color as it begins to dry. And notice how we're almost there. But this is absolutely a great, probably one of the greatest exercises to really, really show how you understand values. Because your lights can get too light, and as you get darker, you have to figure out how to combine your darks before they get too dark. I hope that made sense, what I just said. And it unfortunately, it makes sense when it happens to you the wrong way. Where, oh no, all these shadows look the same, and I'm not getting the volume that I was looking for. And that happens because we did not manage the values within the shadows or within the lights in the way that we should have. We let them flatten out. And that is because we were looking at the wrong thing. We maybe forgot about the area, the shape of it. And instead of simplifying the area, we went for something a little more complex. So say, oh, I'm thinking of nose instead of this little small shape of shadows that get lighter as it goes down and then darker as it gets underneath. So especially here, the values on the nose and under the nose and the whole play of light that's happening there. On the lips, under the lips, around the lips. And then obviously your technique, your managing of the technique of wash. So notice how I'm waiting and staining as it begins to dry. And I'm borderline getting too close to being too dark. When I bring in line, it may be too dark. So I'm going to tell myself, caution, you're getting right to the limit of where it's just going to look pushed, forced. And as I'm trying to correct a misreading of values by just darkening. And then you darken everything. What needed to be lighter gets darker. Then all the other darks have to be darker in order for it to work. So it's only so far you can push it. And I'm going to save that mostly for just a few touches with brush, but mostly with line. And I do love some of the effects that are happening. I can really enhance that with line. And then that, knowing what should be line, what should be wash, and how the combination of both benefits and works for you. Time for me to bring out a little more ink. Just a little bit. And watering it down just a little bit again. This may be darker than my previous darkest value. I'm going to be very careful, and it may be a wise thing to just switch back, just testing it over here, to go with the smaller brush. But I like that. And I'm going to add some of those, some of those shifting blacks within the black, as I saw them in that image. That was the levels image. And as it dries, I could already see how it is working. Now this I got really, really light. And we're going to slowly bring it up. So definitely need to move to a smaller brush. Now that I'm getting more linear, the shapes get smaller, more complex. I'm going to move down to a number 1 brush. And that's because I'm working obviously with this size, 9x12. As we get smaller, need to be able to get that fine. So remember, I was not doing lines. I'm trying to get the shape and the wetness of the paper to allow it to just get that gradient. Oops. That will help me create the shape of it. And I may be rushing. I need a little more patience. Some of these are still too wet. And before you get fully linear with the brush, that's when you consider, okay, it's time to move, if I need to line and decide what tool, what ink pen, fine liner you're going to decide to use there. There's a nice, beautiful play of light into dark right here under the eye. So right on the lower lid, there's a lot of light catching that then turns into the white of the eye. So we're talking variations of levels. I'm going to have to do that absolutely with line. It is absolutely too complicated for wash. And just final touches here. There may be some washes that I need to, with the smaller brush, just to enhance this cheekbone. The shadow right on this side. And underneath the eye. Again, looking for whatever biggest, simplest shapes I could catch, just to make it easier on the eye. But you could see how I'm getting really deep into into almost what looks like detail. And it will be obviously more efficient to let this dry a little bit and begin to add the lines. And for those lines, I will go to the black and white image. I'm going to let it sit. I always talk about patience and how to manage that. This is the moment you need to pause, take a good look at it. Give it a little time. And while I do that, I'm going to give it a little bit of air. And this is going to be fast. It's drying really quick. So when I use this and it's not going to drip anymore, I like to give it some air on the back side. Really make it bone dry. And it won't affect the paint as much. But the paper also will, if it buckled a little, it'll go back to flat. Wow. Actually, it gets like stiff, as if, kind of like if we stretched it. So yeah, that's a great technique. When you heat it from the back and you're able to heat it from back, it just dries it thoroughly. Perfect. So I'm gonna get to line work. So my choice of fine liners, I'm going to start with something 0.5 may be too big for this, but I'm going to actually just go ahead and use a 0.5 in the bigger areas. And I would say something like, do I need to go into this area here? So I see some folds on the shirt here. What is my choice of line? Is it going to be cross hatch, scumble? You actually can go to your favorite. So here I'm just using parallel hatch and then cross hatch. Immediately you see how it just enhances. The key is going to be how much, and not to color in. So I am going to go with most cross hatch, parallel hatch, and maybe here and there, for example, right here, just a little scumble. I'm going to have the smaller pens ready as well. So I think a 0.2 is going to be a good number to go with. And you're going to see here, as I was mentioning, here on the side of the nose, I'm actually not working on the nose, I'm working on the cheek and the shadow side of it, where I could begin with a little parallel hatch in the darker area, but the scumble is the one that's going to give it that nice roundness. And as it goes into the light, I'm going to a smaller, even smaller pen, a 0.05. It is such delicate light that's happening here that I really wanted to break it. There it is. That's the one. And actually begin to get shaping. Again, staying away from too much of linear. I want to preserve as much quality of good wash, whatever came as a good. So I'm scumbling, really aware of that roundness of the cheek as it bends in back, how it gets darker. So managing very soft, light side here, and then saturation as it turns towards the mouth. Just a quick look. You can begin to see the contrast there. How much do you need? In this case, it was not much. Now we do pay attention to how our drawing is working out as well. Some of those lines. And sometimes just a couple of dots stippling instead of scumbling, or crosshatch even do the trick. Little rounding, parallel hatch. And the mistake here would be to try to draw it. You still are developing the shapes of shadows. So you look at a shadow, you see the values, you see the side, the contrasting values in and around next to it, and then, if anything, the direction. Make a choice on which is the best style of line that will describe that. Most of them will do. You cannot go wrong with stippling. You almost always cannot go wrong if you're making it with good read of value with parallel or cross hatching. And then scumbling gets a little more, but we did the exercises. We know how to work it, how to read and give it that roundness. We're dealing with expression here, but the most important thing is the amount of wash, the amount of line, and how to maintain that value. I'm really looking forward to get to the eyes. There are some linear elements, like here in the lips we have some cracks that are just so thin and delicate that, yes, obviously they're rounding down into shadow, but they're so small that I'm not going to be able to deliver that quality of gradient from light to shadow in such a small little line. So we very carefully break that line and give it that feel. It's not just a scar, or it's just one of those bumps where the light is catching. And to begin to get comfortable with the quality of line. Now you're also going for a stylistic look. What do you want this to look like? Gestural, photorealistic. Switching over to a number 1, a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier line. We have some, and I'm going into a little bit of stippling. A lot of it also becomes blind drawing at the stage where you can actually read in and not make up information. We're looking at our reference, our subject, and we make a decision, we take a good look, and then once I pick my spot, then I deliver it. Then I don't have to be working blindly. I know what I'm looking for. I know where it is. I sense the value, And then I just deliver it. More of the stippling here. I think, just like in the photo, some of that shadow on the cheek, and I'm going to have to revisit some of it so to get a better sense of wash. So I'm losing a little bit of feel here. And what I'm going to do is, instead of using so much line, I'm going to add just a little moisture, because this line here is so important, I feel, that you're going to want to make sure it's washed in. See the difference right away? And it was a little too light for the earlier part of it. Now that I have this, and I'm going to add one extra layer here to this darkest area. Because the more I can do with wash, and the less line I have to add, the better overall quality. If I could do it all with wash, great. And in this case, it's all getting layered and layered. And you have plenty of contrast working already. Now what happens here is we're going to have to dry it again. Make sure it's fully dry before we bring in the pens once again. Finishing some smaller areas of contrast here where I see it a lot easier now after bringing in the pen. And managing between drawing and watercolor techniques. Just a few more. Looking at all these areas and staying focused not to get carried away. How do you catch yourself when you're getting carried away? You just take a breath, pause, always good to pause, stand up, walk away for 10 seconds, look at it from a distance, lift it, angle it, turn it upside down, get a different read. All of these things just to give you a little time and space for a better understanding. I'm going to add a little more air. Great. Looking good. Now I am looking at some of these washes. I'm going to leave that for last. You can see that we can go back and forth from line to wash, more wash, dry it, come back with line. Nope, needs more wash. Back and forth, layering, line, and wash. Ideally, you want to get the washes all out of the way and build up as many layers of washes to the point where you barely need any lines. That, I think, is a great goal. If you could get there. And then you realize the power of a line when you actually use them with very, very strong washes. I'm going into this eye here. Spend some time, develop this just a little bit. Crucial, yes, gonna have to deal with some line. Some very peculiar, very descriptive elements of line. Dealing with the shape and the light on these eyes, which, as we know, make or break an expression. Having a little sense of volume and depth within the eyelid to the iris, to the pupil if I see one. And I'm just going to scumble this eye. So a little variation from mostly parallel hatch, cross hatch, and a little scumble here and there. Let me show you that in a close-up. So this eye right there, I wish I would have shown you before and after. We'll do it on the next one too. You see the wash. If you were to look at this without context, you could see, well, that's an abstract painting maybe. What is that? Just a stain of something? But when I begin to bring in line, and I'm just going to jump from one to the other so you could see how I already like some of the gradient colors that are going on here. When I begin to add line, what I did is I just mixed a little bit of variation from what's going on in other areas with the cross hatch, parallel hatch, and here for the eye, I'm going to bring in scumbling. So first I go with the line, broken line, just descriptive line, which is trying to capture the roundness, the three-dimensionality of this side of the eye, the curve of the eyeball, that sphere sense. There's all this light and shadow happening here within the white of the eye, on the eyelid. So just a few lines, parallel hatch for this shadow. Great example how to mix that one with the rest. This one's going to be maybe a cross hatch, starts as a parallel hatch, and then a cross hatch to give it that curvature as it lightens towards the end and towards the middle. And it darkens as it goes up into just the upper ridge of that eyebrow. Already you could begin to see that definition. I may go very light just to add a few lines for value, just to darken that little bit of value in the white of the eye. And what I did in the other one is, now that I have the lines here, what I did is I just scumbled the eye, going a little bit darker in the middle and leaving light right as it reaches the outer lower edges. And it really just comes alive. So continue scumbling into and out of it there. And that immediately takes a completely different look. It really just came together. So notice how, when I say little, it wasn't a lot of line work. Going for more crosshatch here. It could begin to be a little hairy or broken. The other thing would be to make sure you have the right size of fine liner or pen, ball pen, if you're using a fountain pen, to have a little variation in the gauge of your lines. More parallel hatch and cross hatch for the upper side of the eye. And we do have a lot, I mentioned them earlier, some of those wrinkles here in the forehead and on the side of the eye that are not just lines. So I'm going to scumble them. And what I'm trying to do is one pass that gets lighter towards the outer edges and then denser right in the middle. And it's just the illusion of falling in, getting darker as you go into the deeper side of that line. And we have some that are really prominent. But again, you make choices on which is mandatory, which is essential as a description of this character, and which you can just do without. Already I feel that's very descriptive. That's a lot. Beginning to just do a little more blind. Kind of, again, it's not stippling, it's not parallel hatch, it's a combination of almost all three of them, where it goes from parallel hatch to cross hatch to somewhat of a stippling hatch or scumble hatch. Sometimes continuous, sometimes a little more dashy, just focused on direction and separation of the line. Adding more of this parallel hatch with another, I think these are important, right at the bottom of the eye, that light. So it's descriptive, linear. And very closely we pay attention to how dark is too dark. Are we getting close to too dark? And we should be able to read that value. I think I'm still far away from it. There are areas that are dark and are getting darker as I add more line, but it's still in the range where I could push further and be okay. Probably not going to bring in any more ink of the darkest value where it's just black ink. The wash has worked really well. And it's all about line work now. The direction of some of these lines. Some stippling. Here, how do we deal with hair? I'm going to just kind of dash and stipple it just like that, with a lot of space in between. And that's it. That's enough right there for that insinuation of there's a little hair on the side, not on the top of the forehead. I could repeat a little bit of that on this side as I parallel hatch and kind of scumble into the ear. Create, if you look at that black and white image, you'll see all the shifts and shadows that are happening right here on this side. But remind yourself that you're always exploring. You're always exploring your technique, how you're seeing things, number one. How am I seeing my subject? How am I interpreting? What is this thing that stands out the most? How am I trying to resolve that? If I see it as a problem, what's the solution? But overall, am I using the right strategy? Am I becoming a little more expressive, gestural? Am I allowing some experimenting, even some feeling to come through? Or am I just being more automatic and going right back to the technique that makes me feel and don't have to question it? As long as it works, well, that's great. But imagine if you looked a little deeper, how much further can it go? So even if you have that technique that you feel comfortable with, that you know works, they say, why fix it if it's not broken? Well, it's not that. It's how much farther can it go if it already goes this far? And you don't find out until you give it a shot. I was saying the other day, I was listening to an athlete talk about practice and questioning the saying that goes, practice makes perfect, and saying that that's absolutely wrong. Because you could practice all day, every day, but if you're practicing wrong, you're never going to get that perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And that makes total sense. And in a way, I've always felt it. I've always known it. But how do you know if what you're practicing is leading you towards perfect? By questioning it. You need to, okay, is this as far as I can go, or can I go further? Pushing yourself to limits and risking in order to see, can my technique handle this? Can I push ink, washes, pen, ink, lines, subject matter, portraiture, anything? How much more am I willing to risk and then do it? Or am I holding back? And if it is practice, and it's always the same type of practice, then it could be actually slowing you down. Or developing bad habits, which is even worse. Which is the one thing you do not want to do. Because then they're really, really hard to get rid of. And that goes for anything you do, sports especially. Once you practice and you're practicing wrong and you're developing a muscle memory, a habit, to get rid of it is going to be just impossible. So you could see how much line I'm adding here. And at this point, I'm almost just freely scumbling. There's a good quality of just the amount of value transitions from wash to line. And the line, how do I play with value shifts? Well, it's the quality of your hatching, scumbling. Notice that I'm going for just absolute looseness. And as long as you understand, stay connected to your subject, and then feel artistic license, the freedom to push it to where you see it. If you have a vision of, let me just push the wash and add more line of this quality. It actually is exciting. And when you feel that, warning, it may be addictive. And that's why we do it. Always the hope of finding something new. Okay, so here, moment of caution. I love some of that plain, very simplistic. You saw how I did these washes. You can actually see the hard edges, but somehow it still works. Not needing to add way too much line, but the quality of the line here. I'm using a very small, in this case I'm using a 0.1. So the quality of the line I can handle very slowly and get a good read on the immediacy of, is that too much? Not enough? But here we begin to get really, really close to that point where, is this done? More parallel hatch. Just dimming down, giving a little break to that other type of line. I'm going to shift to a bigger pen, back to a 0.5. And I just want to add some hatch variations right here to this area where we could see just a little variation of line. And not to overdo it. But to feel like you have permission to do anything with these washes and lines. And I used to say this a lot. And I kind of pulled back for fear of it being taken the wrong way. But encouraging to go make a mistake. And this is a good drawing for that. Go look for that edge. With caution, but be okay with making a mistake. Just adding a little extra dark in my darkest areas. And there we have it. Pablo Picasso, washes and lines. And there's just one more way of drawing with ink portraits. So the final thing would be we dealt with just line. One last thing would be to do it with just washes, no lines. And any of the portraits, to revisit them. And we actually did a great series with the Mona Lisa, Frida Kahlo, Salvador Dali, and now Picasso, to take your favorite and revisit and maybe shift the technique. And encouraging you to, next step would be just using washes with no lines to take it from one extreme to the other. And I really enjoyed this series. Lots of great work. I hope you enjoyed it.